Thank you so much for joining us in our webinar on publishing clinical studies today. We will explore why consumer brands should publish their results in an academic journal, for example, and what the process is and what the challenges are, and also how much it costs and what the timeline is. And I am joined today by our Director of Clinical Research, Dr. Scott Conger, and Scott has extensive experience when it comes to publications. Scott, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think you have over 30 peer-reviewed journal articles. Is that correct?
Yeah, I'm approaching 40. I'm getting closer to 40.
Awesome. That is
Yeah.
great. And in case you don't know who I am, my name is Susanne Mitschke. I'm the co-founder and CEO of Citruslabs. Citruslabs is the leading provider of decentralized clinical trials for brands. And we work with supplements, with superfoods, cosmetics, pet health products. And typically, the goal of these clinical trials is a substantiated product claim. And if you're interested in conducting your own research, you can contact us at hello@citruslabs.com or can visit us at www.citruslabs.com. Now, before we start, just as always, some housekeeping. If you have any questions, please put them into the Q&A in Zoom or in the chat, and we will answer your questions at the end of this webinar. Scott, thank you so much for being here with us today. Could you just quickly introduce yourself?
Yeah, happy to be here. Excited to talk about this topic. So my background is in exercise physiology, have a master's degree and a PhD. I started my graduate work all the way back in the 90s, and immediately started getting involved in research and found that I really enjoyed it. So after I finished my education, I have worked in a number of jobs that had research components. So in traditional academic settings, I've worked at med schools, I've worked with the Department of Defense, and I've also been working in industry. But kind of related to our discussion, since we're going to be talking about publishing in the process, it might be helpful to just understand what my experience is in publishing in general. So I've served probably just about every role that you can. I've been a subject in countless studies, especially when I was a graduate student. I've been a lab technician or a research assistant that was just helping out with the projects. I've been the principal investigator of studies. I've been a senior investigator. A senior investigator's job is to supervise the principal investigators. And I've also, outside of that, have served on independent review boards that are overseeing the ethics and standards for all research. And from the publishing perspective, I've published a number of studies. I've been a peer review for a lot of different journals. And I'm also an associate editor for an academic journal. So I think one area, my last little area that I haven't done is I haven't been an editor for a journal, but I don't think I want to do that. So, but I do have experience in research from just about every angle you can think of. So hopefully that'll be helpful in our discussion today.
Yeah, that's amazing. So you've done it all and you have a ton of experience when it comes to research, also publishing. And I think it's also great that you actually have experience as a peer reviewer as
Mhm.
well, because I think this is something that many people underestimate.
Yeah.
So, first question, why do you think it is important to publish a study in a journal, specifically, consumer brands? And we are talking about, supplements, and oftentimes ingredients, they have already, tons of research behind them. But why do you think is it important to actual publish a study in a journal? And why should brands consider it?
Yeah, publishing can mean a lot of different things. Writing an article for a magazine or a newspaper, writing a book that for a publishing company, or even self-publishing these days is pretty big.
Mhm.
But publishing in an academic journal or a scientific journal it's a different beast than those other things. So the reason why publishing is important is because this is how we disseminate information, specifically into the academic community. And so an academic journal's job is to ensure the information that they're publishing is valid and credible, and also the details are there to allow for somebody else to replicate the study to see if they can get similar results. So it's an opportunity to be very transparent of what was done, how it was done, and how the analysis was completed. Um, so I think this is really important because specifically for um, sharing of information, I think that's the most important thing. The Hippocratic Oath, which is the oath that physicians take, most people understand at least parts of the Hippocratic Oath, which the one that most people remember is first, do no harm, treat the patient to their illness. Um, there's a lot of things related to patient care and patient protection, but one thing that's also included in the Hippocratic Oath is that they have to share knowledge that they gain.
Mhm.
And so that can mean a lot of things. That can be teaching to medical students or other students, or it could be writing what you learned and sharing that out with the public. Um, so these days, it's a lot easier to do that, to share information than it was even 20 or 30 years ago. Um, with today, I could a few mouse clicks and I could access an article that was published today on the other side of the world. Whereas 30 years ago, it would have taken, time to actually get a physical copy mailed to you. And once upon a time, whenever you get an article published, they'd actually send you a bunch of samples that you could then mail out to people as they sent you a little postcard that said, "Hey, can you mail me your study?" So it's so much easier today to get the information out there. And for consumer brands, I think this is really important to allow for them to show the evidence supporting their product in the most scrutinized way possible. It's not just looking at what's the best case or what do we hope is happening, but this is actually using scientific principles to determine if their product was effective at what their outcomes are.
Yeah, I also think from a perspective of substantiating product claims as well, right? It's, it's one thing to run a study, it's another thing to publish it. And then also when so a lot of lawyers are actually um, recommending publication because then your claims in a publication are removed from the point of sale. So let's say you have a product and your product is um, you're selling your product on your website and then you have a bunch of claims and you link these claims to that publication. Then this gives you an advantage also, on your website as well, for example, because then it's harder for, the FTC, for example, to also scrutinize, your claims because this has been published in a journal. This means that a bunch of people that are actually experts in this field have actually, green lighted your publication.
Yeah, it's been accepted in the scientific community as being a
Yeah,
valid set of information, taking away kind of the um, marketing to some extent. It's really focused
yeah.
on what do the results look like. Yeah, so
And
you're right. It's valuable from multiple perspectives, especially kind of from the legal perspective. As you said, lawyers
yeah,
will look for this first.
yeah, exactly. And so one thing that, brands ask me a lot is, where can we publish, you know, these articles? And a lot of them are looking for publications in Nature, for example, or JAMA or the New England Journal. And we talk to this about our clients a lot. And unfortunately, oftentimes it's not very realistic to actually publish an article in Nature. And can you talk a little bit about, how to select a journal and also how brands should think about selecting the best journal for their brand?
Yeah, when you're saying that, that kind of gives me an analogy related to that. Let's say I'm an artist and I painted a painting. Um, I'd love to have it hanging in the Louvre in Paris.
Yeah.
Now, is that a realistic goal? Maybe not on my first painting, maybe on my second or third one, or maybe never. I think the vast majority of people would be never. And that's kind of what you get when you're thinking about publishing in Nature and JAMA and New England Journal of Medicine and those types of journals. Just like in every field, you have quality of journals. Um, so and those are quantified. So scientists, of course, are going to make numbers out of it and quantify it. And they're using what's referred to as an impact factor of a journal, which tells you, essentially, it's telling you how many times is an article cited, the average article, how many times is it cited in that's published in their journals. So they want their journals articles to be highly impactful, and everybody reads them and cites them in their future research. So for a little bit of perspective, there's approximately, if you look across all academic fields, there's somewhere in the neighborhood of 30,000 different academic journals. About 10,000 of those, or about 1/3, have an impact factor greater than 0, meaning that it's cited more than 0 times on average. About 100 have an impact factor of greater than 30, meaning that an average article is cited 30 times. And about 20 of those 100 have an impact factor above 50. So those journals that you were just mentioning, those are all journals that are in the top 20 of the 30,000 journals that are out there. So these journals are unbelievably selective in the articles that they publish. For these journals, typically, they reject 90% of every study that is submitted to them. So we're talking about only the top 10% of studies are actually published there. And so they're rejecting a lot of really good research studies, but they have such a high standard that not every study is actually going to make it there. So those types of journals are looking for usually the most sophisticated methods of measurement, very sophisticated statistical and analysis methods. And they also a lot of times are looking for populations that are going to be very specific or very large sample sizes. So if it's just looking at something that's relatively common, so something like obesity, then a lot of these studies are going to have thousands of subjects in their studies. So, those are great goals to have, but I am a fan of setting realistic goals, and those might not be the best goals to set. So how do you decide? How do you figure out what's the best fit? Where should a article go? Well, first thing you do is you want to look at what's the scope of the journal. So every journal has posted on their website, these are the types of research studies that we publish. So that's where you would want to start, is looking at the scope. And then you want to look at the acceptance rate. Now, that shouldn't necessarily matter, but it does give you an idea that, okay, if this journal has an acceptance rate of 30%, then there's a pretty strong possibility 2 out of 3 articles are rejected from them. So that's something else to kind of consider when you're deciding this. Oh, and kind of related to that, it's not only a faux pas, but it's actually, you cannot submit the same article to multiple journals at the same time. Almost every journal I've ever submitted to, they require us to sign an ascension statement saying that this article is not under consideration in any other journal. And it kind of makes sense, because what if 2 journals accepted it at the same time? Then it's who owns the copyright for that? They're publishing the same information. So you have to kind of go one by one, find the right journal, submit it, go through the process, and if it doesn't work out there, then you go to another journal.
Yeah, and also when you publish a study, oftentimes these articles are behind paywalls, right? It's not ideal, especially if you want consumers or other stakeholders to read these articles. Oftentimes, you always mentioned, Scott, that you have to essentially have access to a library then to read it. But then there's a workaround, which is open access. And can you talk a little bit about open access and what it means?
Hmm. Yeah, open access is basically a way to get around the cost for the person that's going to read it. So the there's the way that you can actually get access to an article is um, get a subscription to the article or to the journal. So if you, Suzanne, if you or I wanted to join a society and that society had a journal that was associated with us with it, it may cost us, a couple of $100, something like that to join. But for a library to do the same thing and get access to that journal and all of the articles, they have to pay like 10 times that amount. So it may be $10,000 or $20,000 that they're paying for that annual subscription because then all of their readers can have access to it as well. So if you're
Mhm.
not associated with an academic library, oh, by the way, that's why medical school libraries have such a big budget, is because they have to pay for these journal subscriptions.
Yeah.
Um, and so if you want to have access to it, and you look at the abstract and you click on show me the article, then a message will typically pop up and say, hey, sure, you can have this article. 49.99 is all you have to pay for it. Um, but so that's going to be a limiting factor on how many people can view it. So in the last probably 10 years, certainly, and maybe even longer, maybe 15 years, there's been another option that's come up in some journals, and that's called open access. So essentially what open access does is it moves the cost from the reader or from the subscriber to the publisher, to the author. And so the author pays a one-time fee up front
Hmm.
that can be somewhere in the $2,000 to $3,000 range. And that article is now going to be free for anybody in the world to access at any time. So you're going to dramatically increase the number of people that can read the article by going the open access route. It's just you have to kind of budget it in up front and be prepared
Yeah.
to to absorb that cost so that you can get more people to read the study.
Yeah. And I know that a lot of, brands think that, this is free, but there is this fee. And then, Scott, there are also page fees and submission fees, right?
Yeah, even for journals that don't have open access, there are some that have no fees that they charge, but more journals than not, if they don't have open access, then they also have page fees. And so that's another thing that the average person doesn't necessarily realize is when you publish a study, you're not paid for publishing it. And in fact, it's quite the opposite. You're paying to
Hmm.
publish it. So you're paying the cost that it takes to actually print the journal out. You're
Yeah.
covering some of those costs. And so the page fees can vary from one journal to another. They're marketed in a lot of different ways. So sometimes it may be $200 covers the first 5 printed pages, and then maybe $150 after that. Or others will be like $75 for every single um, page that's printed. Usually, I would say that it's typically going to be in the $800 to $1,000 in total. That's usually what the final bill would be if you have to pay page fees.
Okay. So we talked about fees. Let's talk a little bit about timeline. So obviously in CPG land, everything is always very quick, and a brand accepts, everything to go as fast as possible. But publishing, I think, works a little bit different, right? What timelines should brands consider when publishing their study?
Yeah, it's a moving at a glacier pace in the publishing world. It's a relatively long process, so typically a minimum several months. So starting out, preparing the manuscript, formatting it correctly, and then submitting it, that could take a couple of weeks by itself. Once it gets to the editor's desk, then the editor may take a week or so to give it kind of a primary preliminary review, and then they'll send it to a section editor. And then the section editor's job is to find uh, content area experts that can review that. And so these are people who are in the field, academians that are in the field that understand that type of study. And so they're going to give their very thorough analysis of the study, looking at every aspect of it, including Is it justified? Is there some good justification for doing this study? What methods were used? Was the data analyzed? What was the results? Did the authors interpret the results correctly? Um, and they're going to go back to the editor, to the section editor, those peer reviewers they'll go back to the section editor and say, here's my feedback and here's my general recommendation. The section editor then, and that could take 30 days. It could take a month before the peer reviewers get back. In my experience, when I've had to seek out peer reviewers as a section editor, sometimes that takes me 3 weeks just to find a couple of people to volunteer, because that's what these are. These are all volunteers. And so it takes a lot of time to do this. So then once you respond back to the section editor, once the peer reviewers have responded back, then the section editor will kind of summarize their results and make a recommendation to the editor, and then the editor will respond. And so the responses are typically, looks great, perfect, accepted, no changes. That never happens. So accepted pending some minor changes. You might have to change a few things. Accepted pending major revisions. So it could be accepted, but you got a lot of work you need to do on this.
Mm-hmm.
Or I'm sorry, but this just isn't a good fit for our journal. So reject. So if you get the reject, then that basically means, okay, we got to start over with another journal. So back to the drawing board, go through the whole process again. If you get an opportunity to submit revisions, that's a win by itself, just getting that chance. And then you're going to have to respond to a lot of times some very challenging reviewer comments. And you can't just pick and choose, say, oh, I'll answer this one and not that one. You have to respond to every single comment that they made, because ultimately it's going to come back to them. And if they say that, oh, you haven't done a thorough job, then they're going to say, I recommend rejecting this article. So realistically, once it gets accepted, then a couple of weeks to get to the editor, or the print editor, who's basically going to get it ready for how it would be posted on their website. And then within a couple of weeks, it would be posted there. So best case scenario, we're talking 6 to 8 months. If it gets rejected, or if you have multiple revisions, then it could take even longer. And to actually get to print after it's been accepted, it may be 6 to 8 months after it's been accepted before it actually makes it into print, if it's a print journal. However, once it's accepted and they publish it on their website, then you have a publication then. So it certainly would be appropriate to list it as a peer-reviewed scientific article that's been published on the product. But yeah, months. So 6 months to a year is not uncommon, maybe even a little bit longer in some cases.
And one question I had, like, to follow up on this, when there's a reject, you mentioned that sometimes, when you get the comments, when you're commenting and then the reviewer thinks that you didn't do a good job in,
Mhm.
addressing their comments, that's a reject. But if it's an immediate reject almost, is that done fairly quick?
Yeah, so there's a couple of ways that it could happen. You have what's called a desk reject. And so that means that it's the editor or the associate editor has done kind of that preliminary review, and they'll send feedback pretty quick. And by the way, so the journal that I'm the associate editor on is not a huge journal, but it's an impact factor of about 3 or so. Every single time that they send me an article, so I get assigned articles, and they'll send me a note that says, by the way, remember that we are enforcing 25% desk reject. So they basically say that 25% of the articles that I see, I should probably turn one away out of every 4 before that's even sent to peer reviewers.
Mhm.
So the nice thing about that, so yeah, that hurts a little bit, but the nice thing is that it is quick. They'll usually
Yeah.
let you know within a couple of weeks. So I think I mean, it's better to know then you say, okay, I can move on. And you don't have to go through the long process.
Yeah. And what do you think is the biggest challenge in publishing a study?
Yeah, there's a few things that are particularly challenging. Finding the right fit, finding the journal that's going to be the right fit is an important one. Um, Getting to the point where you actually get reviewer comments, that's important. And then responding to those reviewer comments, that can be really, really difficult. I've had articles that I spent 20 hours, 30 hours working on a response to reviewer comments, where it would be 10 pages, 11 fonts, single spaced in my responses. So yeah, there's a lot of work that goes into it after you've actually written the entire paper and submitted it. But yeah,
That's
the finding the right fit and reviewer responding to reviewer comments, I think those are the biggest challenges.
yeah. And you mentioned to me a couple of weeks ago that sometimes you also have to find your own reviewers.
Oh yeah. Like I said, peer reviewers are volunteers, and that's a really difficult job for an editor. I had an editor that I know a little bit. He and I have interacted a few times. He reached out to me the other day and said, "Hey, I've sent this article out to 30 people and nobody's accepted it. Can you help me out? I need somebody to review this article." And so I said yes, just because I knew him, and I also know what it feels like to be on his side. So um, to kind of alleviate some of those challenges, some journals they require you to suggest 2 to 3 reviewers,
Mhm.
so that will shorten their time as they're looking for experts in the field. Sometimes they'll contact those reviewers, and sometimes they won't, but at least they have a kind of a
Mhm.
starting point. Um, I don't see that quite as much as I used to, and I think it's because AI has been able to match up potential uh, content area experts based on what they published in the past and make suggestions right up front. And that's what for the journal I work with, there'll be a list of people that they think might be good peer reviewers for me to select from.
Awesome. And I see that we already have a lot of questions from the
Okay, great.
audience, but
Yeah.
before we go, toward the audience questions, one last question from me is, obviously there are journals, and it seems to be tricky and a little bit more on the expensive side as well, to publish something in a journal. And are there any other platforms where brands, could or even should publish their study results outside of an academic journal?
Yeah, that's a good question. One option is to publish their study on clinicaltrials.gov. And
Mhm.
typically we would recommend doing both. Publish
Yeah.
on clinicaltrials.gov and try to get it published in a academic journal. They are reviewed on clinicaltrials.gov, but not to the same level. It's not the same level of scrutiny that you get from a journal, but your results are out there in public and in the scientific community.
Mhm. Yeah.
Um,
And I think, sorry, Scott, but I think that the NIH, if studies with an NIH grant, I think they now have to publish their
yes.
results on clinicaltrials.gov, right?
Yeah, if there's federal dollars involved in it, then yeah, they're required to be transparent and
Hmm.
publish it there. Another place that is a possibility is at an academic conference. So
Hmm.
academic conferences, they have their own level of review that they go through, but it's not quite the same scrutiny. Um, I do know that some abstracts that are submitted are rejected at academic conferences, but it's a much lower rejection rate. Um, the nice thing about that is for a lot of those, the when you present at an academic conference, regardless of the presentation type, so whether it's just a poster presentation, whether it's a podium presentation or whatever method, they'll publish the abstract in typically a supplemental issue of the journal. And so you could cite that as a publication. It's not exactly the same, but um, it is an abstract that's been published. So that's usually how people would report it, is this is a published abstract. So that's another option. What are some other options that you kind of have in your mind, Susanne?
Yeah, I'm thinking also of, websites. So we do have a couple of clients that actually publish the entire report that we gave them on their website. Obviously, it's not, the same level as an actual manuscript that's peer reviewed, but I think it's an incredibly good start um, to kind of publish and be transparent, because the reason why we want, anyone to publish their clinical study results is transparency, and, show that they conducted this research, and show, essentially be proud of their research. and tell the world how their product, behaved in this setting. So website, I think, is a great starting point. And then another thing that we see brands increasingly do is actual press releases and media outlets. So it is somewhat publication, but very far removed from peer review and from actual academic journals. But I think it's great when studies, especially studies that had terrific results, when they get, into the public eye, because then, the brand is perceived on a higher level that, oh, they did an RCT, or, oh, they're self-funded, bootstrap brand, but they still, decided to, conduct a pilot study, for example, and these are the results. And now as a result of that, they are conducting an RCT, for example. So I think it's always great to see that. And also, what you mentioned with academic conferences, there are also non-academic conferences that are specifically, for CPG brands, for example, Expo West or Expo in general. There's also the Expo East or supply side, for example. I think, you know, presenting results of a study, even like at these conferences, is a huge win.
So these non-academic conferences, I've never been to one, but they do publish research studies, or they do
They
present.
don't, yes, they don't, but you can present there. And
Yeah.
then, part of your presentation is to actually showcase, for example, the research
Okay.
that you've conducted, especially when it's a little bit more sophisticated research, right? Where you did not only have questionnaires, but maybe you added biomarkers, uh,
Mhm.
blood draws, for example, or specific trackers where you get like digital markers.
Yeah, the press release route, that's another option, even if you publish in an academic journal, to release it as a press release, because there's only going to be a specific population really that are reading the academic journals. To get it out to the layperson, a press release is a good way to kind of release, this is what we found in our study, and the press release will then be potentially picked up by who knows how many different websites
Exactly.
or papers or magazines.
Yeah.
Um,
Exactly. And there's also this one specific website called PR Newswire where you can, essentially put your press release out there and then, oftentimes it just gets, picked up by a lot of outlets.
yeah, yeah, those are great other options.
All right. So typically I would ask everyone now to put their questions in, and please do. Please put your questions into the Q&A, or if you can't find it, you can also put it in the chat. And I will just go through a bunch of these questions now. Um, so one question that I think is very interesting is, what are some of the most common reasons clinical trial results are rejected from peer-reviewed journals, and how can companies avoid these pitfalls?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think that there's a lot of things that could be related to the study design, making sure that the study design is sound to be able to answer the question that you really want to address. And so that's where the CRO plays a big role in helping in uh, choosing the correct study design. One thing that is going to be absolutely important is it has to go through an IRB review if it wants to be published in a journal. If it has not gone through independent review boards,
Hmm.
making sure that the ethics are covered, and essentially what an independent review board's job is to look out for the participants and make sure that they're being treated fairly and they understand the risks and benefits. Every journal you have to have a statement that says this protocol has been reviewed by an
Yep.
independent review board before it's been submitted. So if you don't have that
Yes.
study design, it's going to be rejected. But the way that it was analyzed or the way that the data was interpreted, those are common reasons. Or other things would be, this is a good study, it's just not high enough quality for this journal. That's another reason
Hmm.
why it's commonly rejected.
Yeah. And especially when you are thinking of publishing this, like right from the start, you conduct a study and your goal is to actually publish this, it is good to communicate that beforehand, because then we can make recommendations on study design, on methodologies, for example, to actually make this work for the specific journals you selected.
Yeah, yeah, good points.
All right. And does the location of the clinical study affect, okay, that's not so much about publishing, but affect customer trust? If we sell our product in the US, but our clinical study is done in Asia, will that have an effect on how customers view the study? I don't think it would, to be fair. And I think also from a publishing perspective, if you conducted a study in Asia, you could still publish it in a US journal, right?
Yeah, yeah, you just have to, where it's actually done doesn't really matter. Typically, I will say that from colleagues that are from non-English speaking countries, they say that journals that are English, written in English, those are the highest
Mhm.
impact journals in the world. So where it's actually done doesn't really matter. Most of the journals that I read, I'd say that probably 2/3, maybe 3/4 are coming from outside of the United States.
Mhm. And going back to rejections seems to be a big topic. What happens if you keep getting rejections, and how do you know when it's time to pivot or stop, um, you know, essentially entirely stop to submit your journal articles?
Yeah, how many times can you take getting punched in the gut and keep getting back up? So the approach that I take is I'll usually have a list of a few different journals that I think might be good fits, and I'll start with the highest impact journal first, and then I work through my list. Um, and if it keeps getting rejected, it's not bad to have an article rejected. I have had a lot of articles rejected, and actually my studies have improved because of that, because of the feedback I've gotten from reviewers. My personal record is 5 rejections before the sixth one actually accepted it. Um, but once you get down to the very lowest level journal, and you get rejected there, then you may want to pivot at that point. But I think, just being realistic and having a conversation with your entire team, that can help to make some of those types of decisions.
Absolutely. And so another question was around using a CRO. So what are the benefits um, using a CRO for clinical trial versus doing it internally for a supplement brand, and will that impact publishing?
Um, okay, so internal, I think that those are typically called white papers. So
Hmm.
those white papers are basically what they use within an organization. They may be very sound study designs, but the rigor of ensuring that proper data analysis and how you use the data is unknown at that point. So the role of the CRO is to kind of be that third party that's unbiased, and they can actually have the study completed without bringing in the bias on a good perspective or a bad perspective for a product. So um, I think that using a CRO is helpful for that because it kind of takes it out of those white papers and gets it out to a third party to do
Hmm.
those types of work.
Yeah. And one person just asked also about examples of journal articles. To that person, I just sent you an example um, of one of the articles. And then one question I think is very interesting for dietary supplements. Is it necessary to publish the study to substantiate the claim on the label? How does the FDA assess the relevance of published and unpublished studies in terms of approving claims?
Yeah, do you have
That's a good
thoughts about that
question.
one? Yeah, that's a good
Yeah,
question.
it's a great question. And this is probably more a question for an attorney. But I try to do my best from talking to a lot of attorneys. So it is not necessary to publish a study to substantiate a claim, but you definitely have to have a study to substantiate the claim, and you are submitting your claims you should at least submit your claims to the FDA. And then, I think there's a box that you can click where has this claim been substantiated? And obviously you should click yes, because it should be a substantiated claim. And then in case they want to see proof, then you obviously have to show your study. And in my opinion, a published study is better than an unpublished study when it comes to specifically, credibility, because it did go through a peer-reviewed process. But I don't think that the FDA distinguishes specifically published versus unpublished, because if your unpublished study, was study design was good, measurements, methods, objectives were great, then, I don't see that as an issue.
Yeah, it's unpublished studies, we call those the top drawer phenomenon. You finish a study and the results weren't quite as strong as you thought they would be, and they end up just sitting in the top drawer of your desk. And so they're hidden from everybody. Even if you get a published abstract at a conference, then that still would be a way to substantiate the study.
And one question I think is also very interesting. It's about citations. How do you leverage your published results to get other studies to cite you back?
Yeah, that's for the author of the study. They want everybody to cite their study. Making sure, I think the biggest thing is to ensure that you're going to get as many eyes on that as possible. So that's where a open access journal is going to help get as many eyes on it as possible. Also picking journals that are on some of the major search engines. So if I wanted to look up how does this particular product affect sleep, then you search that in some of the big search engines. Those search engines like Google Scholar and PubMed and Web of Science, they only have so many different journals that they actually index on their search engine. So making sure that you're picking the right journal, again, that's a big reason to kind of to use those journal articles that are on the bigger search engines. But I think the best way to answer that is if we can get as many eyes on it as possible, then that's going to increase the likelihood that people will cite it.
Absolutely. And then one question was also about how do you actually market your study, right? It's about what you said, get as many eyes on it, right? Post it on your social media, on, Instagram, TikTok, wherever you are, on LinkedIn. Maybe you even want to send this out to, leaders in your specific field so that they see it, and make a really big deal out of it, and run some press releases as well, put it on YouTube, discuss your study on YouTube, for example. I think that could also be nice, because it's not necessarily only for the scientific community that they're interested in it, but very likely also your customers are interested in it as well.
Yeah, I mean, look and see where are most of your customers getting their information, and then make sure that you're posting it in those places. That's a good strategy to use.
Easy.
Yeah.
Fantastic. Well, then, thank you so much, everyone, for being super active and asking many questions. And this brings me to the end of today's webinar. Thank you so much for spending some time with us. And, if you're interested in conducting your own clinical studies, you can reach us at either hello@citruslabs.com, or you can go on our website, www.citruslabs.com, and fill out a contact form there. And also, if you already have a study and you want to talk about publishing it, just send us a message as well. Thank you so much, everyone, and I hope you all have a great rest of your day. Bye.